Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a review on a Jkoo Dao, this one right here. And I have used and abused this sword to the point of failure, and I'm going to share with you the experience of doing that. Before I do, a couple quick notes. One, this is a review sample. I got it for free. Jkoo sent it to me to do some testing and to share with you. Two, I don't study Chinese swordsmanship, which for those of you that do will be painfully obvious throughout watching this video. So do keep those contexts in mind as you hear my musings and ramblings. Couple notes about the sword. One, I don't believe Jkoo actually makes this sword specifically anymore. Most of the options that I see on their website look like they've even addressed some of the critiques that you'll hear outlined in this video. But it looks like it's similar to the offerings that they have around $189 or $200-ish on their website today. So I'm going to assume that that's roughly the ballpark that it would cost if you were to want one. If you want one exactly like this, you'll have to email Jkoo, and I will incidentally put weapon specifications and the link to their website and all that information in the description down below. So this is what remains of the Jkoo sword right now, and what I will tell you just straight away is that it was a really fun sword to cut with. It did not feel particularly good, and it gave me kind of a sour impression when I first got it, but wow, was it actually fun to cut with. It went through branches and thicker materials than I would have expected it to, and it stood up to a lot of punishment, honestly, in terms of the breaking, and what's left is still technically a functional weapon, or was when I had it. I found it to actually be a pretty durable sword, and once I got it moving, it was pretty fun to use. But there's a couple things that I really didn't like about it, and most of it starts in the hilt. So from a distance, aesthetically speaking, I really am no authority on these things. It looks very simple and pragmatic, which is basically what this is supposed to be. It's an inexpensive offering of a Dao, and I don't exactly know what Dao they were going for. It was sent to me as Chinese Dao. I'm sure it has a typology or maybe a mix between a few of them, but I'm not sure exactly what to expect, though this does look like a stereotypical iteration of a Chinese Dao handle. Basic, just very simple fittings and things like that. It had a little nut at the end of it, and what that did looked a little off, but you could attach a tassel or something like that to it if you wanted to. It would also let you tighten it down. Now, the construction of that nut is worth noting. If you unscrew it, then at the end of this, there would be another nut, which actually tightened the blade onto the handle, and then this cap, which is hollow, is tightened on with that end nut. So there are 2 points of contact to kind of keep the sword on there, or 2 screw points that would, I guess, keep it tight. One for the nut handle, and then the nut pommel area, and then the other, which had a series of washers on it that was compressing the grip onto the sword. And it didn't actually loosen at all the way through breaking the sword, through throwing it, through doing all sorts of things. It actually held up really, really well. So I'm not usually a fan of these kind of nut construction swords, but this one in particular seemed to do its job despite all the punishment I threw its way. And I literally did throw it. Later you'll see me kind of toss this. That's where I found that this pommel was hollow as I threw it at a tree, and it came back and had a big old dent in it. And that's where I could see that it was hollow, which reduces the weight. And honestly, I didn't know that a lot of times they're thicker metal than this, but it was perfectly fine to be hollow. I just didn't happen to notice it. It did also have a little bit of wiggle around it, so it's relatively simple. There's not any sharp ledges or any bad transitions on it, but it would wiggle around. I probably could have fixed that by tightening the nut down. I didn't, and I didn't really notice it when I was actually using the sword. But under pressure, I could move it around a little bit. Anyway, in terms of the rest of the handle, transition-wise, the kind of wrap around it doesn't transition particularly well, but there's no sharp ledges that would hurt my hand when moving it around. If I transition up the grip here, it has this cord wrap on it, which actually feels like it moves around, and you can see me kind of push it underneath, but despite the fact that it moves, it never actually came off or unraveled. So it proved to be more resilient than I thought it would be. I thought it would come undone. It did not. It does not come off the handle particularly easily, but it is too big. This handle is very meaty. I have relatively large hands, big sausage fingers, and while I don't necessarily like big grips, I can usually hold them comfortably. This one is a little too big. It's even beyond axe handly, and I think that's been addressed in some of the newer versions that they have. It has kind of a darker wood, and then a peg that goes through, which I can now see is affixed to the tang here. So this obviously looks like a small tang. It seemed to hold up for what it was intended to do. It didn't break off at the handle despite some of the punishment I threw its way. So this junction area is reasonably secure, all things considered. So it screws down here, and then there's also a peg that goes through this tang, and then there's some glue that held the handle on together and kept it from rattling, though I don't know how tight it is or how much glue's in there, but I would assume a reasonable amount. Then it has a kind of a brass collar on the top. It's relatively thin material, but there's a lot of wood in here, and it stayed pretty solid throughout the usage. It also has a crossguard, a rounded guard section. It's called a suba, the way that I usually note it, but that's the Japanese term. It's a guard, and it's made of thick brass and held together pretty well and actually look cosmetically okay. It has some imperfections in the casting quality, which I can see, but overall I didn't notice any problems, and it was also smoothed out, so nothing bit into my hands or anything. As I move down the scabbard, I think it's handsome looking from a distance, but a lot of these little fittings have pointy bits, which I can kind of get a fingernail underneath or will poke me. They're reasonably well fit to the sword, though, all things considered. I've seen certainly sword fittings that are worse in terms of how well they fit onto the scabbard than this. For the money, this is not bad, but I prefer them recessed into the wood. Overall, for the money, though, this is a reasonably handsome execution. The sword would stay reasonably tight. It would come out with a pull or a push of the thumb. It didn't fall out easily upside down, but if you shook it, it would come out, and it didn't rattle obsessively, but I don't know exactly what to expect from these things. It has some darkened wood, and I noticed that there are some stains in the one that I have, so I'm not sure if that's from the wood, but I can spot some stains that were not there, or likely shouldn't be there anyway in the wood. You would prefer it not be stained. It's smooth, but I do notice little pockets and imperfections in the wood. It's not necessarily the highest caliber wood, but for what it is, it's all right. I also, on the fitting, note that this thing will just move around. So I can basically, this belt section is not secured at all or glued down. So it will move around pretty easily. I guess that allows you to reposition it. Maybe you can put some adhesive on if you want, but it basically just slides around. There's also some hammer marks from the rivet, which is a little brass or copper peg that holds these things together. So bear that in mind, I suppose. Now, in terms of the blade, pointy stabby part, again, I can talk about the tang. This is going to concern people because it looks small, and it would concern me if I saw it because it looks a little hodgepodgey, but it held together really well, and you'll see what I did with it when I punished it. This tang proved sufficient, and the way these shoulders met the guard proved to be sufficient. This didn't prove to be a weak point in the process of testing. I don't see any cracks or imperfections or problems here. Again, there was a nut that held it onto the handle here, and then another nut at the end that held the pommel area on. The shoulders rested right into the guard rather than having some sort of blade collar that they rest in, which is, I guess, how I typically see Dao done, but maybe for the cost-saving measures of this one, it wasn't on there. The offerings that I see on the website now do look to have that option in there, or rather have a collar on them in some way. Anyway, this junction, as rough as it might appear, wasn't the cause of breaking, and I put it through some pretty strenuous testing. If I talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, well, there's not much left of it now, but I did have some when I initially started this review. It's made out of a folded steel, and that has a pattern which is nice to look at. It's a little more bold and interesting on one side than the other. The lines on it, in terms of the bevels and whatnot, are reminiscent of a Japanese sword, and they're smooth and lack some of the refinements in polishing that I might like to see. The edges could be more crisp, particularly in where the false edge on near the tip is defined. The edge came reasonably sharp. I did, before cutting with it, hone it up with basically like a ceramic stone, and I just did a few passes on it. I didn't take it to a belt sander. Again, it was just a couple passes with the ceramic stone to get out any burrs that might have happened while it was jiggling across the pond and shipping, but I wouldn't necessarily call that exactly sharpening. And in terms of the tip, it has a pleasant looking tip, though. Again, the polish is tough to see. You have to kind of get it in the right light to make it out. You can make out the pattern, but the tip doesn't look exactly fantastic to me. I'd like to see maybe better defined edges. In terms of taper as well, it has a very gradual distal taper, but it's a pretty chunky sword, pretty hefty in the hand. And I suppose that brings me to feeling of the sword. So dimensions and all that kind of stuff will be in the description down below. But feeling-wise, this handle made it very difficult for me to feel connected to the sword. It felt chunky and hard to move. It's a very thick, robust blade, and this handle made it hard for me to really feel like I had a secure purchase on. I could get two hands on it, but I was trying to use it in one hand, and it was just not fun to move. I didn't feel necessarily in control. I could throw it out there, and it felt like a mean chopper. But in terms of point control, in terms of fencing or something like that, it wouldn't be a choice at all. It feels more like a camp machete or something like that, which I don't even know if I'd want to do that. It'd be too heavy to move around consistently. But I didn't feel like it was particularly good in the hand. It felt more cumbersome to move than I'd like it to. And dimensions and all that kind of stuff will be in the description down below. You can kind of see what I'm talking about there. Anyway, I don't study Chinese swordsmanship. I didn't move it around. I didn't make any attempt to show you it in motion. I would say that it felt heavy and clubbish. Some of that may have been addressed in future iterations of the sword. In terms of performance, though, it worked exceedingly well. So I had a lot of luck cutting through pool noodles. It zipped right through, which is shows that the edge was reasonably keened up. Again, I did touch it up with a ceramic stone, but that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. But it popped right through, and I found it actually easier to move around once I was kind of getting the hang of it. Then I took it to some water bottles. I had some reasonably good cuts. Bear in mind that my stand is uneven, so any time that I can successfully cut through the water bottle and leave a portion of it even mildly on the stand, that's an accomplishment for me. Also, not just that the stand is uneven, I'm not particularly good at it, but I also tried cutting right into the neck of the water bottle, and the sword didn't have any dings, pings, or issues whatsoever. It stayed straight. It did all the things that it was supposed to do in cutting those water bottles. Again, I keen the edge up, but I've very often found, particularly in cold weather, incidentally, that if you cut it in the neck of a water bottle, that it can diminish the edge of the sword. I didn't spot any issues whatsoever in cutting directly into the thickest parts of the plastic. It's also worth noting that it's snowing while I'm doing this, right? So the sword is quite cold. It's not helping the sword as you compare it to other swords that I might have tested. If the sword is really cold, it's more likely to take some damage. So note that this is also going against the sword. Anyway, after doing that, I cut into some logs. It chopped right through the logs. It was actually really surprising how thick a log I could, or branch I should say, that I could cut through. Now, again, bear in mind that it's snowing outside. It's quite cold, so the material might be frozen, and it is not helping or being fun for the sword because the material is wet. These are newly fallen branches, or relatively new. They're not fully dried out, and it's quite cold out, so that makes it even more impressive, I would say. Now, I also then smacked the sword on the side of the stand. It did take a bend in doing that. So the sword will bend. It's not tempered in such a way that it springs back to shape readily. It took a set. And that's something that I actually noticed in tossing the sword. The next thing that I did is I threw the sword at a tree, and that's where I noticed that the pommel was hollow. It stayed on. It stayed tight, but it took a big dent in the pommel, or the little end cap area. The sword didn't necessarily bend, but through several tosses, I noticed that things started to loosen up a little bit, as well as in one case, the sword landed in kind of the stump of the tree, and it bent the tip pretty aggressively. Now, I could straighten that out with one of the branches that I cut and just smashing it back into shape, but the sword did take a bend relatively easily. Well, I won't necessarily call it easily. I had to hit it pretty hard on the stand, and it had to have its own weight and momentum to bend the tip, but it would bend rather than spring back to shape, and I would say maybe easier than you might expect from a through-hardened steel. Anyway, once I did those tests, which I'd say it held up to actually pretty well, and actually surprisingly good at cutting, surprisingly good at edge retention, surprisingly good at not taking damage in some of those things, or bends, some of the really bad cuts that I threw at chopping logs, but it did bend a little easier in terms of intentionally trying to put a bend in it. From there, I took it to the brass fitting on a old water heater base that's braced. It did diminish the edge in doing that, but nothing rattled apart. And that's where I would say if this was a concern, it would have kind of cracked apart. It puts a lot of stress right on the handle. There's a lot absorbed in the sword, and if it's going to break at the handle, then it would have done it, or could have done it on that portion of the test. It diminished the edge, and I would say it in a way that is reasonable. From there, I brought it to the croquet stick of doom, several hard strikes, and eventually it broke. Now, it didn't have to be turned around on its spine to break the sword. I was able to break it just by impacting the croquet stick of doom, but a couple things to note there. One, it took a lot of strikes. Two, I had to strike it pretty hard. And three, it's freezing outside, and so that's not helping the sword in terms of it not being brittle. So bear those things in mind. Overall, I would say for the money, it held up really, really well, and it was a much more fun cutter than I gave it credit for. I didn't like the feeling. I thought it was kind of cumbersome in the hand, but I imagine if this were cut off and you shaved down the handle a little bit, if you're willing to do some of that work yourself, it was a fun tool to move around. It would still, even if I could get a grip on it, it would fundamentally change how good it felt in my hand, but it would still be a heavy sword at the end of the day. I did find after moving it around, though, that it became a little bit more fun. I didn't notice that my shoulder was fatigued in doing the testing that I was doing, but I also didn't practice with it doing any kind of martial arts for an hour or so beforehand, which is customarily what I tend to do in these reviews, is I move it around and I practice with it and I get a feel for moving it. But my shoulder didn't fatigue in smacking it into things. So I did get a feel for it, but I would still say most people are going to find it a little bit cumbersome, and this handle wasn't doing it any favors in terms of feeling connected. In terms of performance, the edge keened up really well. It held an edge really well, and the edge seemed quite durable. It was a little bendier than maybe I'd like it to be, but overall I would say I'm very satisfied with how well it held up given how aggressive it was. And I'm glad to see that this build design didn't cause a fracture or didn't cause it to come apart at the hilt. So do I think it's worth it? If the price is around 200 bucks, then yeah, I would say I'm glad that they've improved some things. This is a little thick and stout, and I'm glad that there's a blade collar on there, but it's a decorative looking thing, even with the simple fittings on it. It's a bit stout in the hand, but if you want to do some meaty chopping in the backyard, then it's okay. And the steel seemed to hold up reasonably well. So all those things in mind, yeah, for 200 bucks, it does not seem like a bad deal, but do bear in mind that it seems stout. Even if those handle things are corrected, it's still pretty meaty and still pretty plain. If you want something more elaborate, then I'd encourage you to reach out to Van at Jkoo, and he can maybe tell you what is within the realm of their capability to make zazzy or lighter or any other critique that I might have brought up to you to figure out in whatever build you want on a sword. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble and mumble. That's all I've got. Hopefully the video has been helpful. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.